For those of you that don't know about green, does anyone not know about green bonds? Okay, that's pretty good. I'm assuming everyone knows about green bonds. I'm here because that's been the interesting development in financial markets over the last 3 to 4 years. A rapid growth to what's now a $600 billion market of thematic bonds. That is bonds which are issued by banks, by municipalities, by corporations, by sovereigns, where the money is promised to social purpose. A bit like an SDG. In fact, some have been looking at SDGs. This is a bit of a new phenomenon. We have a global pool of institutional investors, in particular, who are excited about this prospect of meeting their yield and risk requirements, which are usually regulated, and as well as that, being able to report to their stakeholders, their members, their governments, that they are helping to deal with long-term sustainability, and to report, and this is the opportunity for us, and to report to their actuaries and their long-term planners that they are doing something to mitigate the risks involved in the storms we're sailing into. So in climate change, Swiss Re, Munich Re, the reinsurance companies in the 90s began to understand that they had an assets and liabilities matching problem 40 years out, because climate change is going to mess up everything and mess up the chance to create sustainable returns. And as a result, they're looking for ways to mitigate that long-term risk while meeting their short-term risk yield requirements, regulated as they are. So if they can do both, it's a fantastic win. That's what a green bond is. Now, of course, we need to start looking at the same question around SDGs. You've heard a lot today about the problems, about the vast challenges. You know, we've got a lot to do in SDGs. We have a lot to do, as Achim Steiner says, around climate. We're heading into a storm. It is not only a storm made up of the direct impacts of emissions, it's also a storm because we have lost the first wave of the fight of climate change. We will now see a century of significant volatility in our weather systems, which means our agricultural systems, which means our ability to feed ourselves, which means the disease, the war, the social dislocation that comes when you have famine followed by food, followed by flood, followed by pestilence. That's what this century is going to look like. We can't avoid that. We're now in a race to simply avoid catastrophic outcomes. You know, when people talk about emissions, the IPCC said last year that we need to get emissions down within 10 years to have a chance of any kind of reasonable future for our children. What they didn't say is that the volatility we're beginning to feel in weather systems now around the world, including the failure of the Russian wheat crop in 2010 and all the fallouts from that, is as a result of emissions that were put into the atmosphere 30 years ago, before we started talking about the Kyoto Agreement. We've put in more emissions into the atmosphere in the last 30 years than in the previous 150 years. We have failed monumentally at a UN COP level, I can tell you. And the weather we experience in 30 years' time will be as a result of the emissions that we're putting into the system now. In other words, even if we stop fossil fuels tomorrow morning cold, we will continue to get much more severe weather systems for the next 30, the next 50 years. Now that has some challenges. It means that our job on the planet now is not only to start looking at reducing emissions, one of the SDGs, it's also to look at resilience. We have to understand that in a world of volatility is a world where we all got to be resilient. The storm is coming and it is a very dark storm. We have to batten down the hatches. We have to put the food aside. We have to improve our agriculture so we can get better productivity to where the times when there'll be drought or flood. We need to improve the stability and resilience of our societies, our ecosystems, as well as our infrastructure. What does it mean? Well, there's a few things we know as a result of some fantastic research that's been done over the last 50 to 60 years about what makes resilience in a society. And remember, the societies that will be most impacted will be the societies that are poorest. We know that you have to have, at a minimum, the amount of wealth in a society to be able to rebuild your roads when they get washed away. That's more South Carolina than Puerto Rico, if you like. That, of course, is much more England than it is Mozambique. How do we actually do that? That means we've got to have better distribution of wealth around the planet, or else you know what happens. When we have a severe weather crisis in Nigeria, and there's no chance of rebuilding an economy, those people have to cross the Mediterranean. It won't be 1 million, it'll be 10 million people trying to get across the Mediterranean. We know there's a direct correlation between equality in society and fragility, or rather lack of fragility. The more unequal, the more they fall over when hit by a crash. Very simple. So we can't afford a dozen Somalias in a row, or a dozen Syrias. We need to ensure we don't go there. That requires us, based on correlation and what we've seen in the last 50 or 60 years, to rapidly scale up efforts around improving equality. So, give you an example of how this plays into the SDGs, and I'm trying to make an argument for the investors who've got excited about climate change that the next step is to look at SDGs, not because they're good in their own right, which they are, but because they're actually about dealing with the long-term risks of their portfolios. They're about dealing with the long-term risks to our societies, our economic systems. If we look at a correlation of one thing, the education of women, we know that participation in the workforce, and in small business especially, of women, is directly correlated with improved levels of equality in society. i.e., the more women participate, the less likely a society is to fall over in times of severe weather volatility. Sound familiar? So there becomes a climate change reason, an economic resilience reason to power that particular SDG, because education of women is what leads to participation. Simple, really, isn't it? And if you look at each of the SDGs in a similar kind of way, you're not just looking at the need to reduce hunger for its own sake, for human rights, you're also looking about it in terms of how to make those societies more resilient. We need the Philippines to be very resilient. That means the Philippines has to be wealthier, more equal, have greater participation, and so on. So that's the opportunity to stretch this agenda now to take advantage of what's happened in the green agenda. That's part one. You've heard a lot today about the kinds of investments we've got to make. You've heard a lot today about the scale of the investment. Achim Steiner talked about it. So when you start putting together climate, and the switch to sustainable infrastructure alone is about $90 trillion of investment between now and 2050, including reorienting investment that we currently have. Enough of the freeways, more of the railways, please. That sort of thing. When you start putting that for the resilience investments we have to make, this is a very big parcel of effort. There is, as Achim said, absolutely no way that public sectors can deal with this in their own right. So we do have to look for other means of financing our solutions. Now, I appreciate the comments earlier in the panel before last about liberating the people who've created the problems in the past, but you need to understand about who's got the money now. The money is not in Coca-Cola or Goldman Sachs. The money is held by people like PGGM in Netherlands or NBIM in Norway, institutional investors. $100 trillion of capital on the planet is currently managed by pension funds, insurance funds, government funds, and investors that have long-term mandates. They have liabilities and assets matching problems which are more than 3 years long. These are not hedge fund dealers in New York. They're the ones who really have the capital. They're the ones who have an anxiety over the long-term sustainability of their incomes. And often they also have an anxiety over the long-term sustainability of the planet. Thank God someone does. They're the ones that we need the partnerships with, not the Goldman Sachs of the world. They're just the intermediaries. When we start thinking of those in that way, it changes what we might be able to do. And insurance funds like Allianz, who has a strong commitment to greening its portfolio, is 90% in bonds, by the way. And if you want to get a sense of bonds and equity, $60 trillion US is in equity globally, $100 trillion is in bonds globally, outstanding, just to give you a flavour. They are very interested in bonds in debt that will help meet SDGs and green bonds. They can't get enough of them. They are looking for more investments. When we've seen SDG or green bonds issued, they are regularly oversubscribed. The most recent was the Dutch sovereign, admittedly AAA, okay, easy to sell, but nevertheless, they went looking for 4.5 billion euros of orders and they got 21 billion euros of orders. But that happened in Nigeria too, with the initial $30 million green bond the Nigerian government done, which was way oversubscribed by Nigerian pension funds. That is not just rich country investors. We have the opportunity to tap domestic investors with this as well. We do have, as again you heard this morning, the capital available. It is this serendipitous moment in history that at this point when frankly our existence as a species is threatened. You know, we're looking for a world at the moment, or expecting a world of about 800 ppm by the end of the century. You know, when you've been in one of those meeting rooms at UNDP for 3 hours and no one's opened the windows and you can't breathe? That's about 1,000 ppm. We're looking at the moment at the whole planet being 1,000 ppm sometime next century on current trajectories. That's what we're heading out toward. There's another curious thing you may not know about being in that UNDP room for 3 hours. When the air gets to 1,000 ppm, your brain functions in a much slower level. You become slightly stupider. So at the end of those meetings, think about what people are saying and just discount them. But that won't be so good next century when we're as a species try to survive in air that we can't breathe in, because just as we're having to deal with something that's going to basically kill us off as a species, we get stupider. Hallelujah. On the other hand, at this particular moment in history, luckily, while we're facing this future, while the air is still breathable for a few more years, we have capital. We have this extraordinary amount of capital. And again, you heard earlier today, a lot of that capital is sitting in low interest rate bonds and other investments. In fact, in Europe, 21% of all the institutional investment in Europe is sitting in zero or negative interest rate bonds. And I'm going to tell you, some of that is my pension money. And it's not going to give me a pension when I finally get to retire if it's earning zero on German bunds. It needs yield. And this is the thing that's often missed about this. While on one direction, the road we're currently travelling, and have been since 1988, is Mordor, is a land of incredible heat, is a land of famine, is a land of war and pestilence, and those rooms you can't breathe in. On this side of the track, if we invest in the transition, and by transition I mean mitigation investments like clean energy and low carbon transport, but I also mean resilience investments that help share wealth and ensure that the world can survive in a world of volatility. If we go in this direction, we will have essentially a century, but certainly half a century, of vast Keynesian stimulus. We will have a century of job creation. We will have a century of wealth creation and middle class creation if we manage it properly. Now, admittedly, we've got a good track record of messing these sort of things up, I appreciate. So this requires people like UNDP to give advice to governments. This requires governments to start looking at history of sustainable development. We need Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan to understand the mistakes of the last 30 years, of which there have been many, my God, and then plan accordingly. We need a global pool of knowledge that looks using science, and remember, science is what's going to get us out of this, using science to understand the policies that have worked and the policies that don't. And I'll take you to Beijing, if you like, where you can't breathe the air either. And I'll get you a Chinese official to talk about the terrible mistakes they've made in the last 30 years of licensing industrial development in areas that destroyed ecology, that destroyed the environment, that has made the food undrinkable and the water undrinkable, and the air unbreathable, and the deserts encroaching, because of the bad policies around development. Now, I'm not going to say in front of a Communist Party official, you made a terrible mistake, but they will admit that, if in private to you. They will understand. Now, they achieved fantastic things in that time. Development often achieves fantastic things. But we have an opportunity now. We have an opportunity to leapfrog past the mistakes of the last 30, the last 50, the last 150 years and go straight to green, and go straight to sustainable, and go straight to an SDG compliant, if I can say, economy. Because we do know what we've done wrong in the past, and we can share that knowledge. That's the opportunity we have, and what these sorts of events give us. Now, we've got a beginning of a market in the private sector, and I'm not trying to say the private sector will solve this problem. If you go to America and you hear people say, look, it's great, the private sector will solve everything as they have. Look, they invented this fantastic iPhone. You can just remind them that 60% of the patents in the iPhone are from government research labs. If you look at the development of America's economy in the 1950s and 60s, 90% income tax on the top tier was the norm in the 1950s, and we had 50 venture capital funds in the United States in the 1950s that were government seeded, who had 10-year investment horizons. Don't look to the rhetoric, look to the reality. The reality is a close working relationship between government and private capital. Government does have to give. Government has to provide something. It has to provide, that scary term, rule of law. It does have to provide things like recourse for investors. It's going to be very interesting in India to watch the play out of the bankruptcy law, which was a major initiative by the Modi government last year to finally allow banks and investors to get rid of promoters of companies who just never left and didn't pay their bills. This is part of the detail, the ugly, painful work of a government minister, reform of economies, to make it more palatable for private investors. That does have to be done. But that doesn't mean abandoning social goals. On the contrary, people complain sometimes about public sector lending requirements in India, but Europe has its own version of this. In Europe, you have risk weighting differential in the capital ratio requirements of banks to benefit SME lending. That is, if you're a bank and you make loans to SMEs, you get a better capital ratio requirement. These are simple instruments, by the way, they're very cost-efficient instruments that different governments can use. Look around the world and you'll realise that for the last 200 years, 150 to 200 years, we've actually been remarkably successful in some economies at growing investment in policy priority areas. It doesn't happen with pure open markets. It happens with managed markets. It happens with directed markets, particularly when time is short, when tempo is required, such as a war, for example, or maybe a crisis facing our species. We have to hope on that one. So it will require activist governments, but governments will have to work with international investors. That will be a tempering thing. They will have to work with NGOs who understand the problems of the ground, because investors are now listening to NGOs. In Europe, PGGM, the Dutch pension fund I mentioned earlier, listens very carefully to WWF's concerns about environment in emerging markets. If you're an emerging market or a developing country, or maybe you're Uzbekistan, you need to understand that there is now a constellation of interests around understanding what sustainable development is. And we have to respond to that. We are no longer islands. We have to work together on all of this sort of stuff. We will need regulatory drivers. We will need guarantees and credit risk mitigation, as we talked about earlier. That's the bluntest of instruments. There are many, many regulatory instruments that we can provide to ensure that investors will be happier, will have their risk mitigated. None as great as some kind of level of policy certainty. I mean, there's no such thing as pure policy certainty. Hey, I live in a country that's going through Brexit. Hey. But that's what we have to try and do as governments, to give some kind of horizon for their returns. We can sometimes even set up specialist institutions. Municipal finance authorities in Turkey would be a great way to channel money to smaller cities. We've done this in Finland, we've done this in Sweden, we've done this in France. We haven't done it in India or Africa yet, for example. We could set up a different approach to subway development in the big cities of the region. In Hong Kong, MTR, which is a government-owned body, 25% listed on the stock exchange, builds and runs the subways. It is a beautiful way to finance subways because not 1 cent of government money goes towards building the subways. Why? A simple law. This is what you call fiscal efficiency for a government. A simple law allows the government to buy the land where a metro station is going to be built at yesterday's property prices. That just means they are taking the speculative gain when they announce a subway line. They then sell that on to the government-owned Metropolitan Rail Authority, who builds a wedding cake of a development on top of it. They use the wedding cake's capital gains to finance the subway, and every year MTR pays a dividend back to the government. In any city that is dense like Istanbul, this model will work. There are many models like this around the world that we can use. So we do need to start embracing these models that have existed for 150 years, except we haven't been thinking about them in terms of sustainable investment. We've kind of missed the most obvious trick in the book, to look at the history and repurpose what we've done before. Of course, we do need to broaden our understanding of things like infrastructure. We will need to be thinking about our populations as infrastructure, education of women. We will need to think about health as a piece of infrastructure because it allows greater productivity for people. So how do we deliver national health systems? We will need to be looking about how we increase income for the poor because greater equality also means greater incomes for the bottom 50%, which also means, as Henry Ford knew when he paid his workers very high wages in the 1920s, they buy more stuff. It fuels local consumption, it fuels an economy. These are things that we need to understand. The good news is we've got a bit of a start. We do have the SDGs. We do have a green bonds market and a beginning of an SDG market that will merge into the green bond market because we understand that resilience is also part of climate. We do know that the investors are interested, but the money isn't flowing in scale. And it's challenging because, from a climate perspective at least, we're 5 minutes to midnight. The International Panel of Climate Change last year did say 10 to 12 years maximum to get emissions dramatically down, or else, frankly, we're toast. There is no future for our children. And I've got 4 girls, so you've got to fix it up for me. So on that note, I want to ask you a couple of questions. I'd like to ask you, on the basis of today, on the basis of the conversations you've had, on the basis, for some of you who are up on the stage here, the people you spoke to, insights. What have you got out of the day for your work? I'm after a few hints. First, what I want you to do is talk to the person or people next to you. You've got 5 minutes to come up with something. Okay? Now, that means at the back there, I need you off your computer for 5 minutes. Sorry. Talking to the person next to you about what you've got out today, if anything. I appreciate. And then I'm going to ask a few people to put their hands up and give me a reflection. You make a comment, you can ask a question. And if you want to ask a question of some of these very learned people here, feel free to ask it. I'll call them up to answer it. A reflection. 5 minutes, please. Talk amongst yourselves. I need a lot of noise. Talk loudly. And then we'll see whether we're ready for drinks afterwards. 5 minutes. Talk. Insights from today. Talk. 5 minutes is up. Can I call you back? It's amazing how quickly 5 minutes goes, but that was just a rehearsal for the drinks afterwards. So please keep the conversation going then. Now, I want to finish up with a few comments and reflections from the audience. I'm hoping there'll be some volunteers or people who'll put their hands up and say they'd like a mic. Who would like to get me going? Please, a microphone in the middle here. That's right. The people with the microphones have been asked to run. Any others? Next one queued up. Sorry, I'm not taking a call until I've got 2 others queued up. I need participation before I start. Oh, there we go, one there. Good on you, Paul. And I need one on this side to balance out the numbers. Got a mic here? Hey, very good. Okay, please, go ahead. 30 seconds you've got.
Okay, so very quickly. So the first thing is that we were hoping for a more optimistic kind of outlook and saying, okay, we've got it, here's how we're going to choose, so that's kind of, well, still we haven't figured it out. We say it's difficult, we understand it's very difficult, and we haven't figured it out. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it feels like academia, the parties are, UN, international development agencies, businesses, and academia, and many people say academia also can help to solve these problems, hopefully they will. But the thing is that it feels like these three counterparts, they speak 3 different languages. So I don't know how well it feels like they don't really understand or speak one another's language. So hopefully we will find a way to talk to each other that we understand, that make businesses care, and then they communicate that they have to be profitable. So, this language issue kind of, these 3 parties that...
Thank you. We need a Google Translate for this industry.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Paul Horrocks from the OECD. So I think we heard a lot of good comments today, a bit about the corruption, some concerns a bit around blended finance, but I think one of the big issues what we raised was around the debt. And I just wanted to sort of touch on that because it is a concern for us, and we spend a lot of time worrying a bit about this from our members and the use of the private sector engagement. But I think we have to differentiate between debt that's on the balance sheet and off the balance sheet.
Yep.
If you're thinking of off-grid solar, for example, that will often be not on the public sector's balance sheet, but on the privates. So, and that's the risk transfer that we should be encouraging, not imposing big fiscal deficits on countries and harnessing them with significant debt levels that will eventually blow up. So there has been a lot of cases in PPPs that I think we can take and lessons learned from those. But there are lots of really good examples in developing countries of environmental SDG projects that don't necessarily cause the sort of debt levels that we're seeing. So I would suggest that we sort of need to look at those and examine those carefully, but at the same time be very wary that there are significant investments going on in developing countries that at some point could eventuate on the public sector's balance sheet.
Thank you. A couple more hands. I've got a microphone needed here. I've got another microphone, another hand up somewhere. Next speakers, please stand up. Introduce yourself. Sorry, as Paul did.
Yeah, I think we have heard a lot of fantastic, interesting things today.
And sorry, where are you from, for those people who haven't heard you?
Sorry, Jos Noyes from the European Investment Fund, the European Investment Bank.
He's got money, everyone.
We distribute it everywhere. No, but I mean, we have heard a lot of things, very interesting things, and analysis and theories and menaces, and 40 years everything is over and we can't breathe anymore. We have to embrace these SDGs. I mean, and we have to get people embracing SDGs, whether it is in small, and we had the discussion here, whether it is in small examples by the famous citizen, or whether it's the famous private sector. The private sector has to know what is in for me if I take the SDGs on board. What is the return I get out of investing in SDGs? This is the message which we have to convey and which we are not succeeding to convey up to today.
Thank you. Fantastic. Who here was speaking? Please stand up.
Just Dan Berg.
Microphone here.
Dan Berg, independent consultant. Actually, building on that, I was going to raise the issue of replicability, and it's really a question for the bond market. When bond markets work, they're big and they're replicable and they look alike. So how do you create an impact bond that doesn't have to be created each time? We heard good examples today. You create a bond that works in this country for this project in this way with a little donor support, a little government support, a little bit of how do we create a big market? How do we make it replicable so it works each time?
Quick, what's your answer?
My answer is coming back to you, actually, to help us create that. I mean, you build up an example, and I think we're building an example, but it's too slow. And we're building up examples in India, in Mexico, in places where the markets are a little bit bigger. Can you bring that to Serbia or Albania, which I was talking about, to do a bond which is linked to SDGs with a donor involved, or is it just going to take too long? The Turkey SDG example we heard in the last session, it's a nice one, but it's small and it needs to be bigger than that.
Okay, good point. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Please stand up, and I need a couple more hands up in the air over here.
Hi, sorry.
Just before you start, I need the cue. Just hang on a sec. Volunteers who've said something. Oh, come on. You mean you didn't talk about anything in your session? Please, 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 help me out. Okay, sorry, I've tried. Keep going. Oh, there's a microphone at the front there. Fantastic.
Ajay Mariwali from UNOPS. In our group, we talked a lot about how we'd heard much today about the resources that are available and the needs that exist and the need to get the money in the right place in order to bridge that gap. And the question that we posed in order that we felt needed to be answered in order to be able to bridge that gap is very simple, which is how to make social impact investing more profitable. Because we know that the returns on it are not generating at the level that is getting the money to the right place. So if we can crack that, then we could possibly crack this issue. But we didn't have any concrete suggestions in that regard.
I'm going to give you 2 concrete suggestions. Break it up. There's investing. Everything's investing. Don't put social impact in front of it until you've got the investing part right. And then sell the social investing as a bonus story. But if you combine them together, it looks like you get a lower yield. And everyone says, I'm going to get lower yield for social impact. Oh, I'm out of here. So just break them up, and then we can make this work. But it doesn't mean your underlying issue isn't a big issue. There are challenges. Like with transport, there are solutions. It is impossible to finance urban transit out of the revenues of urban transit. It is not possible. So unless you're embracing the property value capture model, you are not going to succeed in this area. There you go. There's my pitch. I've got someone here and then someone over there. Please.
Okay, today it was interesting, but I think... yes. Taras,
thank you.
Mayor of Prizren, one municipality in Kosovo, second biggest city.
You're on the front line trying to make this work. You're on the front line trying to make this stuff work.
Yes. Yeah, I have money, but I don't have enough money to do a lot of things. But basically, I think financing the SDGs is very important, and without doing private sector, we cannot do it. But also, in terms of government, the discussions, I think it's very important, and I understood that there is no easy answer for the questions about how to finance the SDGs. But what I think is very important in terms of questions. The main question that I liked a lot today, it was like how to make from financing the profit to financing for the people, and how to make the international multinational companies and other who have a lot of financial or have a say in financial sector, that if we don't finance people, we will not have people in the future, and we will not have finances in the future. So and in this regard, I think there are very interesting ideas here, and actually in our municipality we have started some things like incubator for channeling the private investment to green economy and to these kind of things. But as I said, it's very hard to move fast enough with all the regulations and everything. And as only one municipality is very limited impact that we can do. And a constant problem is this problem of corruption at the high level, where government decides usually to invest in highways and not in sustainable agriculture. And I think this is not a problem only in Kosovo. I think it's everywhere, and we have to start to make them think the other ways. And I think this question of profit versus people is very important.
Are you optimistic out of today, despite all the challenges?
I think that there is lots of things to do, but for example, on the question about financing, is it enough or different financing? I think is not enough financing of SDGs, but and also is not. We need a new ways of financing the SDGs.
Okay.
And, but it's more we talk. I think it will be better. So I think it's.
Thank you. Yeah. Got a speaker over here. Any other speakers before we move to wrapping up?
Yeah.
Oh, quick, fantastic. Got a microphone over here.
Marcus Heath with UNDP. What we heard today is it's a systemic problem. We have the money. There is really no gap if we have the money, right? And you just mentioned in your eloquent ending, there is an emerging signals. Mm-hmm. Too small, too slow. So if one believes in system theories, what is the moonshot? We're about to celebrate the 50th anniversary of man landing the moon, right? So what is the systemic moonshot that we need collectively? Not single person can do it. From smart regulation to financial instrument to consumer pressure to everything. How then can that moonshot can be designed? One would thought that moonshot was the SDGs itself. But it turned out 4 years on that you need some other kind of moonshot that make the whole system work. And I don't know the solution, but I think if we have 5 minutes to lights out, we can't really go incremental anymore. It can't take 15 years for the next doubling of the green bond market.
Okay, very good point. When you come back tomorrow, bear that in mind. If we're getting things that you think are going to take us 25 years, we have a problem. If you're getting answers that you think can move us in 5 years, we're getting somewhere. So I'm going to say, aggressive in your questioning of those of us who are on the stage tomorrow along those lines, because that's an extremely good point. Please.
I have a number of takeaways from just today.
Good on you.
But at UNDP, where I work, and I'm in Belarus, we're looking at accelerators. So today I heard it very clearly. I heard it from you. But I heard it from the deputy minister with whom I came, the interest in developing green economy. And why is green economy an accelerator? It's obvious. It's greening, it's environmentally sound. At the same time, it's economically profitable, and that's where we want to stimulate and see more investment coming, and the engagement from financial systems and businesses and local entrepreneurs. But also, I really appreciated what you said about equality and resilient society. And we do have, especially in many places in our region, a good basis of social justice on which to build. So I see green economy as a concept, a very practical one, where all these things can come together, and for us to help connect the different sectors. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Any last comments? Yes. Oh, but there's more. Fantastic. Microphone here and a microphone there, please.
Thank you. Just one very quick remark is 50 years ago we sent a man on the moon. I think it's about time we send a woman.
Very good. Please.
Hello, Pınar Dairy. This is Murat. I'm working with the UNDP with the Business Call to Action program. This is not an insight from today, but I would like to make a contribution. I think we need to involve more younger generation to this system in terms of the sustainability of the SDGs. Financing is the core of this model, but it is not sustainable if we are not involved the younger generation, since we are probably die before them, so they will live in on this planet.
Absolutely right. And we see these waves of climate strikes around the world now, which I have to say I applaud, because we do need a reminder that we've got to get our act together on these matters. It is running out of time. Any last questions? Thank you. Oh, yes, yes. Just introduce yourself quickly.
Thank you. I'm Claudia Melle MacLeod, KPMG Norway. In terms of key takeaways, I wanted to mention one of the most interesting things I heard this morning was the contribution from Kazakhstan, where I don't remember the exact statistics, but the speaker said that the number of SMEs or startups, 50% was owned by women, and that poverty reduction decreased exponentially, and at the same time longevity increased as a result of the policies. We also heard that that's oil finance, but we don't need to focus on that. But my point is, how can you engage SMEs? Because if I look at my own climate base as a consultancy in Norway, most jobs are generated by SMEs. And a lot of the people who run these organizations are very keen to do something with the SDGs. They don't know exactly what to do. That's one thing. If you look at the developing world, most income, most livelihoods are generated by small business people. So what I have missed throughout the day is a means to engage with them. Because at the end of the day, they are suffering the brunt of the policies or lack thereof. And also because they really are at the bottom of the pyramid. That's the people that ultimately are going to be suffering or benefiting from these policies and the investment. So I hope tomorrow we can talk more about that.
Have you got an answer on how to engage SMEs?
No, I'm hoping that I'll get that tomorrow from the speakers.
Okay, everyone, another bit of homework for us all tonight. That's the end of the formal session. Thank you for joining us. Remember that we have here quite a lot of knowledge. None of us knows what to do. None of us knows what to do. But we at least have a few people here. We can talk about it over drinks tonight. We have more opportunity to learn here than the bulk of the world's population. We are incredibly privileged because there is actually something that we might be able to do in all of us in our work. We now need to figure out what it is and map it. For most of the world's people, they will be buffeted by a century of volatility. Their lives will be hard, and there's not a lot they can do at this stage. So it becomes our responsibility now to find ways to act. There are no silver bullets here. It's about learning from the past. There is a huge amount to learn from the past. We have mobilized capital. We have shifted societies. We have, in fact, created societies remarkably quickly in history. We just have to do it again in a sustainable and green and SDG compliant way. That's the opportunity, of course, because if we do that, our kids will have a future. Hey, please, I'll see you outside and drinks, and then I'll see you tomorrow morning with these questions buzzing in the air. A big clap for everyone, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. What a way to end the first day. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We had some great conversations, engaging guests. I think it's a great way to end day one. If you'd like to wind down, catch up with some old friends, meet up with some new friends, we'd like to invite you outside. We have a reception for you. This concludes day one. We'll be meeting back here at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning for the start of day two. We'll be starting with a smaller group looking into the risks in investing in SDGs. Thank you, and we'll see you outside.